please say hello in the chat from where you are. I'm Alice from Macmillan Education, and we're really pleased to be today joined with Janelle Julien, who's from Grenada. So she's an experienced educator, researcher and lecturer. She's got qualifications in psychology and advanced research experience in social medicine and health care. So she also has a passion for health and family life education. So we're really pleased to be with her today to have this session. Please use the chat to ask any questions you have throughout the whole session. She'll be able to see those and I'll be able to answer them as we go along as well. It's great to know what schools you teach in, where in the Caribbean you're from. So please interact as much as possible. Everyone will receive a certificate of attendance for today. So that will be on the email address that you registered with. And there'll also be a short little survey, which we'd really appreciate you to complete at the end as well. So I'll happily pass over to Janelle Julien now, and please enjoy the session, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I am Janelle Julien, and thank you for joining us. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this professional discussion on health and family life education, maximizing the use of Macmillan HFLE resources, building resilient learners, and sustaining HFLE as a standalone subject. So today we will consider 4 key questions. Who are our learners? What are we preparing them for? And how can the Macmillan resources support that preparation? And lastly, how can teachers use these resources without unnecessary planning pressure? So ultimately, our focus is on the connection between curriculum, resources, teacher guidance, classroom instruction, and student learning. And that connection is central to our discussion today. Next slide, please. Next slide. Right, so who are our learners? And the slide gives us 4 words: thinking, feeling, navigating, connecting. And then it gives us a statement that I think is particularly important for educators. Every learner brings a story into the classroom. So let us pause here for a moment. Every learner brings a story. So when our students walk through the classroom door, they are not beginning from zero. They already have experiences, ideas, relationships, ways of communicating, and ways of responding to situations, right? And some of those responses may be appropriate, and some may need a bit of reflection, right? Depending on the stage of the learner. So this is particularly important in HFLE because so much of what we teach connects to real life. When we think about thinking, students are interpreting themselves, other people, and the situations around them. HFLE gives us opportunities to help them move beyond simply reacting toward considering what is happening and why. Then we have feeling. Students experience excitement, disappointment, frustration, and many other emotions and experiences. And HFLE provides a structured educational space in which aspects of students' development can be addressed appropriately. Then we have navigating. Students navigate school, relationships, communities, information in an increasingly digital environment. So our responsibility is not to make every difficult situation disappear. It is to help learners develop the capacity to respond appropriately when they encounter those situations. And finally, connecting. Students connect with parents, their caregivers, their teachers, friends, peers, communities, and eventually the wider society. So interpersonal skills matter. Respect matters, listening matters, self-awareness matters. And this is why I want us to resist thinking of HFLE as simply another subject containing information that students have to remember. The learner has to be able to use what is learned. So for example, Knowing that respect is important is one thing, but being able to demonstrate respect during a disagreement, for example, is another. Knowing that communication matters is one thing, but being able to communicate effectively when you are frustrated is another. Right. So that difference between knowing and using knowledge is extremely important, because ultimately the question is not how much information did we give the learner? The question is, what has the learner become more capable of doing? Next slide. Right. So the next slide is entitled A Changing World, A Changing Learner. The slides gives us both opportunities and challenges. And on the opportunities, we see technology, global connectivity, access to information, digital learning. And on the challenges, misinformation, social media, peer pressure, bullying, mental well-being, identity, and relationships. Now, I want to be careful here because we should not suggest that every challenge facing young people is new. Young people have always experienced relationships, peer influence, decision-making, and conflict. But what has changed is the environment in which these experiences now take place. So technology provides enormous opportunities. Students can access information quickly, participate in digital learning, communicate across geographical boundaries, and encounter ideas and perspectives that may not be otherwise be available to them. But access does not automatically equal understanding, and access does not automatically equal accuracy. And that is where misinformation becomes relevant. Our learners need to develop the ability to think critically about the information they encounter, rather than assuming that everything they see online is accurate. Then we have social media. Social media is not simply good or bad. It is an environment in which communication and interaction occur. But learners need skills to navigate that environment. They need to think about appropriate communication, consequences, and how the actions can affect other people. Then there are issues such as peer pressure and bullying. Students may encounter situations where they feel pressured to make a particular choice alone. They may witness behavior directed toward another student. They may have to decide whether to participate, remain silent, seek help, or respond appropriately. And HFLE provides an educational space in which these issues can be explored and discussed. And that distinction is important because we are not trying to tell students that they will never encounter negative influences. We know they will encounter influences. So our responsibility is to help them develop the capacity to navigate them. We cannot control everything our students will encounter, but we can contribute to the development of the learner who encounters those things, and that is where HFLE becomes relevant. Next slide. Right, so let us pause on the question, what is the purpose of school? And the slide offers several answers: exams, employment, citizenship, culture, life. And then comes the question, can we say that we're preparing students for life? I think this is where we have to stop and reflect as educators. Of course, examinations are important. Academic achievement matters, right? Employment preparation matters. Citizenship and culture matter. But if we say that education prepares students for life, then we also have to consider what life requires. And life requires communication, relationships, decision-making, problem-solving, responsibility. And life presents situations that do not always have one simple answer, right? A multiple choice question can have a correct answer, but real life situations are often more complicated. So a student may have to decide how to respond to a disagreement with a friend, whether to participate in something because of peer pressure, how to communicate a concern, or how to think through the consequence of a choice. And these situations require more than memorizing information. They require application. And this is where HFLE can make an important contribution. The purpose of HFLE is not to compete with math, language, and social studies and so forth. It addresses its own area of learning, whilst also supporting capacities that students use across different contexts. And then the slide asks, how passionate are you? I actually think that question is directed at us as educators. We can have excellent resources, curriculum documents neatly stored on our shelves, and clearly stated objectives, but if learning is not intentionally facilitated, the potential of those resources is reduced. So passion matters, but professional commitment matters too. And HFLE requires teachers who are willing to prepare, facilitate, listen, reflect, and adapt. So sometimes the most important part of a lesson is not the amount of content covered. It may be the quality of the discussion. It may be the student who finally feels confident enough to contribute. It may be the student who begins to see a situation from another person's perspective. Or it may be the student who realizes, I have a choice in how I respond. And those are important learning moments. And that is why when we ask what school is preparing students for, life has to remain part of the answer. Next slide. Now we move specifically to why life skills matter. And life skills are sometimes treated as though they are, secondary to what we traditionally call academic learning. But let's consider what students actually need to do. They need to communicate, they need to make decisions, they need to solve problems, they need to interact with others, and they need to understand themselves. And they also need to make choices. And these are not simply extra abilities. They are capacities that students use in everyday life. And this brings us to an important distinction. Teaching a life skill is not the same as telling students about a life skill. If I tell students that communication is important, they have received information, right? But if I give them a situation and ask them to practice communicating appropriately, I have created an opportunity for skill development. Similarly, if I tell students that decision-making involves consequences, they have received information. But if I give them a situation and ask them to identify possible choices and consequences, they have an opportunity to apply that understanding. And that is why activities and discussions and role play and scenarios, reflection, and guided practice matter. So when we look at an HFLE resource, I encourage teachers to ask more than what information is here. We should also ask what skill is being developed. Where will students practice it? Where will they apply it? And where will they reflect? And those questions help us maximize the resource. Next slide. Right. So this slide makes an important connection between HFLE and other subjects. And I like this slide particularly because it helps us avoid a false choice. We do not have to say either we teach academic subjects or we teach HFLE. That is not the point. Different areas of the curriculum contribute to the development of the learner in different ways. Mathematics develops particular forms of reasoning. Science develops inquiry and understanding of the natural world. Language develops communication and literacy. Social studies supports understanding of society. And HFLE gives intentional attention to areas such as healthy choices, relationships, and well-being. So there are also important points of connection. Communication is important in language, but it is also important in HFLE. Problem solving is important in mathematics, but students also need problem solving skills in interpersonal situations. So understanding society is important in social studies, but students also have to learn how to function responsibly within relationships and communities. So HFLE can strengthen learning across the curriculum while maintaining its own identity. And that distinction, again, is important when we talk about HFLE as a standalone subject. Standalone doesn't mean isolated. It means that HFLE has its own intentional place, its own objectives, instructional time, learning experiences, and progression. And at the same time, the skills developed through HFLE can naturally transfer in other areas. So, for example, students who communicate effectively may participate more confidently. Students who can solve problems constructively can contribute to healthier classroom interactions. And students who can make informed decisions are developing capacities that would extend beyond the classroom. So HFLE is not asking schools to prepare students for one more examination, at the expense of everything else. It is asking schools to recognize a dimension of learning that has direct relevance to how students live, learn, and interact. So that is why I believe the phrase essential dimension of quality education is useful, because it reminds us that education is about developing learners, not simply filling notebooks. Next slide. Right. So if we accept that HFLE is an essential part of quality education, the next question becomes, how do we move from recognizing the need for HFLE to actually delivering it effectively? And this is where educational practice becomes important. It is one thing to identify what learners need, but it is another thing to create learning experiences that help them develop those competencies. So for HFLE, that means moving beyond simply presenting information. We need to think about what's our students learn? How will we introduce the concept? What opportunities will students have to discuss and explore it? How will they practice what they are learning? And how will we know whether they can apply it? Now, this is where the quality of the learning experience matters. A well-designed HFLE lesson should give students opportunities to engage with ideas, participate, practice their skills, apply their understanding, and reflect on their learning. And this is also where the teacher's role becomes important. The teacher does not simply develop information on the page. The teacher facilitates the learning experience. So the resource provides a foundation, but the teacher helps students make meaning from that resource. And this is important because HFLE deals with areas that students may encounter personally or socially. The classroom, therefore, needs to provide an environment where students can participate appropriately, consider different perspectives, and connect learning to situations they may encounter. So we've moved from educational need to curriculum intention, to learning resource, to teacher facilitation, and to learner application. And that is the connection we need to keep in mind as we move into the Macmillan HFLE resources. Because the question is no longer simply, do we have an HFLE textbook? The more useful question is, how can we maximize what the resource provides to support meaningful learning? And that brings us to the Macmillan HFLE series. Next slide. Now that we have considered the learner, the changing context, and the role of HFLE, let us turn to the Macmillan HFLE series. So at this point, I want us to shift our focus from why HFLE matters to how the resources can help us deliver it effectively. The Macmillan HFLE series provides resources designed to support HFLE teaching and learning across the different stages of our learners' development. But I want to emphasize something important. The value of a resource is not simply in having it. The value is in how we intentionally use it. So as teachers, we should be able to look at the resource and ask, what is the lesson helping my students to understand? What skills are they developing? What opportunities are they being given to practice and apply those skills? And how does this lesson contribute to their development over time? And that is the perspective I want us to bring to the Macmillan resources today. We are not simply looking at individual lessons in isolation. We are looking at how the student books, the teacher's guides, and the overall progression of learning can work together to support the teacher and the learner. And this is particularly important because one of the concerns we often hear from teachers is the amount of planning required to deliver meaningful lessons. So a resource should not create more unnecessary work. It should provide structure. Next slide. Right. So now that we have introduced the Macmillan HFLE series, let us look at how the resources work together. So the important point here is that the resources should not be viewed as separate pieces. The student book provides the learner with the content and learning experiences. The teacher's guide supports the teacher in planning and facilitating those experiences. And the curriculum provides the broader direction for what learners are expected to develop. So we can think about the relationship as curriculum, then teacher's guide, then student's book, then classroom learning, then learner application. So the curriculum tells us where we are going. The teacher's guide helps the student consider how to get there, and the student book provides resources and activities that support the learner's engagement with the content. And the classroom is where these elements come together. And this is important because the teacher's guide should not be viewed simply as something the teacher consults after opening the student book. It can help the teacher prepare for instruction by identifying objectives, suggesting approaches, and providing guidance for using the lesson. And that means the teacher does not have to begin every lesson by creating everything from scratch. Instead, the teacher can begin with an existing structure and make professional decisions about how best to use it with the particular learners in the classroom. And this is where maximizing the resource becomes important. So the goal is not to follow the page mechanically. The goal is to understand the purpose of the lesson, use the available guidance and activities, and facilitate learning in a way that allows students to participate, practice, and apply what they are learning. Right. So the question is not simply what does the book say? It is how I can use what the resource provides to achieve the intended learning. And that shift in thinking can make a significant difference to the teacher's planning and to the learner's experience. And once we understand how the resources work together, we can begin to look at something even more important. How does the learner's development progress from one level to the next? And that brings us to the developmental progression within HFLE. Next slide. Right, so as we move through the Macmillan HFLE resources, one of the things I want us to notice is that HFLE develops with the learner. The learner does not remain at the same level from primary through secondary school. As learners grow, their experience change, the understanding develops, and the level at which, they can engage with concepts also changes. So when we look across the resources, we should not expect students to encounter exactly the same learning experience year after year. Instead, we should look for progression. A theme may appear more than once, but the learner is not necessarily being asked to do the same thing each time. At one level, the emphasis may be on recognizing or understanding a concept, and as the learner develops, that understanding can become more sophisticated. The learner may then be asked to apply, analyze, evaluate, or reflect on the concept in increasingly complex situations, And this is important because meaningful learning is not simply about introducing a topic once and just moving on. It is about allowing our learners to build on previous learning. And this is one of the strengths we want to examine in the Macmillan HFLE series. The same broad areas can continue across the learner's development, while the depth, complexity, and the application increase. So rather than asking, have students already done this topic? We should ask, what can students now do with this topic that they could not do before? And that is a much more useful way of thinking about progression. The learner is growing, the context is changing, the level of understanding is developing, and the learning experience needs to develop with them. And that brings us to the developmental progression within the series. Next slide. Right. So as we look more closely at the Macmillan HFLE series, we can see that the learning is designed to develop progressively within the learner. And this means that HFLE is not simply a collection of topics that students encounter once and then leave behind. Instead, learning can be revisited as students mature with opportunities for greater understanding, deeper thinking, and increased application. So when we consider developmental progression, we are asking, how does the learner's understanding develop over time? A learner may encounter an idea at a level where the focus is on recognizing and understanding it. And as the learner develops, the same area can become more complex. Students can begin to examine situations, consider different perspectives, make connections, and apply what they have learned. So eventually, the expectation is not simply that students can explain a concept. It is that they can use that understanding in meaningful situations. And that distinction is important. So for example, a learner may be able to identify qualities of a good friend, and that demonstrates understanding. But being able to recognize those qualities in real situations, make an appropriate choice, communicate effectively, reflect on one's own behavior, demonstrates a deeper level of learning. So progression is not simply, we taught this topic before. It is the learner has returned to this area with greater capacity. And that is what we want to see across HFLE. The content may connect from one level to another, but the learner's depth of understanding, level of independence, and ability to apply the learning can increase. And this is what makes progression meaningful. It allows us to see HFLE not as isolated lessons, but as part of a continuing developmental journey. And as we move to the next slide, we will look at the 4 continuous strands through which that development is supported. Next slide. Right. So as we consider the 4 continuous strides within HFLE, right, these strides provide continuity across the learner's development. They help us see that HFLE is not simply a series of unrelated topics. Instead, there are important areas of learning that continue to develop as the learner progresses. So what changes is not necessarily the presence of the strand, but the level of understanding and application expected from the learner. So when we look across the different levels, right, we can ask, what is the learner being introduced to? What are they beginning to understand? How are they being given opportunities to apply that understanding? And how does that learning become more sophisticated as they progress? So this is particularly important because development does not happen in isolated pieces. A learner's understanding of relationships, for example, can influence communication, decision-making, self-awareness, and how that learner responds to situation. So the strands therefore provide opportunities for learning to connect and build over time. And from a teacher's perspective, this gives us another important question. Where does this lesson fit within the learner's larger developmental journey? So we should not look at a lesson simply as something that needs to be completed by the end of the period. We should consider what the lesson contributes to the learner's development, what understanding is being built, what skill is being strengthened, and what might the learner be ready to do next. And that is the value at looking at the 4 strands as continuous areas of development. They help us move away from seeing HFLE as isolated lessons and towards seeing it as a progressive learning experience. And to make that idea more concrete, let's take one theme and watch how it develops across the learner's journey. Next slide. So the slide asks us to watch one theme and it focuses specifically on self and interpersonal relationships. And I want us to use this as a practical example because it allows us to see what developmental progression actually means. So imagine that we begin with a young learner exploring the idea of self. The learner is developing an understanding of who they are. So as the learner develops, the focus can expand toward managing oneself. Then relationships become increasingly important. The learner begins to consider, how do I relate to other people? How do my actions affect others? How do I communicate? How do I respond when there is disagreement? How do I contribute to a positive relationship? And eventually, the learner is considering broader social responsibility. So the important thing here is that we are not treating each lesson as an isolated event. The learner is carrying previous learning forward. That is why the program can be described as a continuum. And that is also where teachers can benefit from thinking across grade levels. If teachers have opportunities to discuss what students have learned previously and what they are expected to learn next, it becomes easier to build continuity. So a grade 4 teacher, for example, can think about what the learner is expected to develop at grade 4, rather than assuming that every concept has to be introduced from the beginning. And a secondary teacher can consider the foundations that learners have already encountered. And that can prevent 2 problems. The first is unnecessary repetition. The second is gaps in progression, and we want neither, right? So we want students to revisit important ideas, but at an increasingly appropriate level. And that is the difference between repetition and progression, right? Next slide. Right, so the same developmental logic can be applied to the other thematic areas here. The program does not need to introduce an entirely new world of learning at every level. Our learners can revisit important areas while being asked to engage with them at increasing levels of complexity. So for teachers, this creates an opportunity to connect prior learning with current learning. So before beginning a lesson, we ask, what my students know, what vocabulary or concepts can we revisit, what new application is appropriate for this age group, and what opportunity will students have to use the learning. And this is the difference between simply covering a topic and deliberately developing competence. So as we continue, I want us to move from the curriculum map into what this progression means for actual classroom practice. The same logic applies across all 4 themes. So the purpose is not simply to expose learners to more topics. It is to develop increasingly useful understanding and skills appropriate to their level. And that leads us naturally to the next question. What happens when we move from primary into secondary? And the slide divides the learning into, next slide, the slide divides the learning into 2 broad stages. Primary, build the foundation, and secondary, use the foundation. And under primary, we see knowledge, skills, values, healthy habits, self-awareness, communication. Then under secondary, critical thinking, decision-making, risk management, health choices, relationships, responsibility. And underneath that, build, then apply. And this is a useful way to think about progression because at the primary levels, our learners are developing important foundations. They are acquiring knowledge, they are developing skills, they are beginning to understand values, they are developing habits, they are building self-awareness, and they are developing communication skills. Then as learners become older, those foundations can be brought into more complex situations. So the learner is increasingly expected to think critically, to make decisions, to consider risk, to make health choices, to navigate relationships, and to take responsibility. So the purpose of the progression is not simply more content. The slide actually gives us a stronger statement, right? The goal is not simply more information. It is increasing capacity to use knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes. And that is the point I would emphasize to teachers. We should not judge progression only by the amount of material covered. We should also ask whether the learner is becoming more capable of thinking, more capable of communicating, more capable of evaluating choices, more capable of making decisions, more capable of taking responsibility. And that is much more meaningful measure of development. Next slide. Right. So what happens to the learner? The content becomes increasingly connected to real-life decision-making. So the goal is not simply more information. The goal is increasing capacity to use knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes. So consider a simple example. Knowing what respectful communication means is one level of learning. Demonstrating respectful communication during disagreement is another. So explaining why a particular response may be more constructive is another. Choosing that response in a real-life situation requires application. And this is why active learning matters in HFLE. Students need opportunities to discuss, to apply, to reflect. And the learning objectives should therefore influence the activity we select. So if the intended outcome involves communication, students need opportunities to communicate, right? If it involves decision-making, they need a decision to make. If it involves reflection, then we need to give them space to reflect. And that alignment between objective and activity is essential. Knowledge has practical consequences. Knowing a definition, is one level of learning. Recognizing an issue in a situation, considering responses, communicating appropriately, and justifying a decision represents another. So our activities and our scenarios, our reflection and so forth, it gives learners opportunities to demonstrate what they can do with what they know. Next slide. Now we shift the lens to the educator. And as teachers, it is easy to begin by asking, what topic am I teaching today? But I want us to consider another question. What am I helping my students develop? So for example, if the topic is friendship, we should look beyond simply teaching students what friendship means. We can ask what competencies we want them to develop. Perhaps communication, self-awareness, decision-making, or interpersonal relationship skills. And that changes how we approach the lesson. we begin to think about what should students actually be able to do? How will they practice? How will they apply what they have done? And how will I know that learning has taken place? And this is where the teacher's guides become particularly valuable. So rather than using it simply as a reference, we can use it as a planning support, right? We can ask, what is the objective? What preparation is needed? What questions can I use? What activities will allow our students to participate and apply their learning? And also, what evidence of learning can I collect? So the educator's lens moves us beyond simply covering content. It encourages us to think about the learner, the intended outcome, the learning experiences, and the evidence of development. Because ultimately, HFLE is not simply about students knowing more. It's about helping them become more capable of using what they know in meaningful situations. And that is the perspective I want us to carry forward as we continue examining the Macmillan resources. Next slide. Right. So let us bring the developmental discussion together. The four themes provide continuity, right? But the learner's development provides progression. So the sequence on the slide, know, then understand, then apply, then think, then decide, and finally act. That is a useful planning lens. So we should not treat it as a fixed developmental rule. Instead, it helps us ask whether the lesson gives learners an opportunity to move beyond recall. So for example, if students know the definition of peer pressure, can they analyze the peer pressure situation? If they know what healthy food choices are, can they examine choices in a realistic context? So the answer should influence the activities we select: discussion, scenarios, role play, reflection, a bit of collaborative task as well. And this can give our learners opportunities to practice intended skills. So the thread is therefore the developing learner. The themes provide continuity. The resources provide content and learning opportunities, and the teacher provides the context. The learner develops increasing capacity to use what has been learned. Next slide. Right. So the slide says, the student book tells the story. The teacher's guide helps you bring it to life. And I think that is an excellent way to describe the student's book, to describe the relationship between the student's book and the teacher's guide, right? Because the student book is written for the learner and the teacher's guide is there to support the educator. And the slide gives us 5 functions: plan, facilitate, differentiate, assess, extend. So let's take each one. Plan. The teacher's guide supports lesson objectives, preparation, and suggested approaches. And that matters because planning takes time, right? Teachers already have many responsibilities. So having a structured starting point can reduce the amount of time we spend, creating every component of a lesson from scratch. Moving on to facilitate. So the guide supports questions, discussions, activities, and sensitive conversations. And this is particularly important in HFLE because some topics require, careful facilitation. The teacher has to create an environment where students can participate appropriately. Then we're moving on to differentiate. Our learners are not identical, right? They will differ in their prior knowledge, their confidence, their communication abilities, and their learning needs. So the teacher's guide can support the teacher in adapting learning experiences. Moving on to assess now. The guide supports checking, understanding, and reinforcing learning. And this connects to what we discussed earlier. Assessment should not necessarily wait until the end, right? Our discussions can provide evidence. Pair work can provide evidence. Group work, scenarios, reflection, they can all provide evidence. And lastly, extend. So finally, the guide provides ideas for reinforcement, application, and real-life connections. And that is particularly valuable in HFLE because the ultimate goal is not simply to complete a page. The goal is to help learners connect the learning to life. So I would encourage teachers to, do not put the teacher's guide on your shelves, okay? Use it. Open it before the lesson, use it during planning, refer to it during the instruction. and return to it when reflecting on the lesson. The teacher's guide is not there to replace your professional judgment, right? It is there to offer support, right? Support of your professional judgment. And now we are going to demonstrate that principle with an actual grade 4 lesson. Next slide. Right, so this is where I want to move from theory into classroom practice. So we are looking at Macmillan HFLE grade 4, level 4. And the topic is Friends Are Special under the self and interpersonal relationship theme. And the slide identifies it as a 60-minute lesson, right? So using students book 4, unit 3, page 8, and the teacher's guide, page 86. The lesson objectives are identify qualities of good friendships, describe characteristics of positive friendships, discuss valued friendship qualities, identify ways to contribute positively to friendship, and demonstrate appropriate communication and respect. So immediately we can see that the lesson is not limited to one kind of learning. Students are expected to identify, describe, discuss, and also identify ways to contribute and demonstrate. And that final word is important, demonstrate. It means we have an opportunity to see students apply the learning. And the life skill focus is also clearly identified: communication, self-awareness, decision-making, interpersonal relationship skills. Now let's look at the lesson structure. Explore. The lesson begins with what makes a good friend, and students identify qualities such as respect, trust, kindness, and honesty. And this is a very useful starting point because it activates students' existing knowledge. The teacher can listen carefully here, what qualities are students identifying? Are they giving behaviors? Are they giving values? Can they explain why a particular quality matters? So for example, if a student says, a good friend is kind, the teacher can ask, what would kindness look like in a friendship? And the follow-up question moves us from a word to a behavior. And that is important because students should have opportunities, to connect the abstract qualities to observable actions. Right. So we're moving on to develop. The lesson then moves into friends are special plus qualities. And the slide instructs us to use the Macmillan text and then connect friendship qualities to behaviors. Again, this is where the teacher's facilitation matters. We are not simply reading, we are connecting. So if respect is one of the qualities, what does respectful behavior look like? If honesty is identified, what might honesty look like between friends? If trust is important, what behaviors help build trust? And this is where the resource can become a springboard for discussion. Right, moving on to apply. Then we move to scenarios and role play. And the slide says groups solve friendship situations using communication and interpersonal skills. Now, students have to use what they have been discussing. And this is a major difference between telling students about friendship and allowing them to practice thinking about friendship situations. So the teacher can observe, how are students communicating? Are they listening to one another? Are they considering responses? Are they able to use respectful language? Are they able to identify an appropriate response? And these observations provide useful assessment evidence. And moving on to reflect. So finally, what kind of friend am I? Students identify a strength and one action they can take to become a better friend. And now the learning turns inward. The student is no longer discussing good friends in the abstract form. The student is reflecting on themselves. And that is where self-awareness enters the lesson. And notice the assessment pathway: discussion, then peer group work, then scenarios, then role play. Right. So now we have reflection. So assessment is not something we have to invent separately. There are multiple points during the lesson at which the teacher can gather evidence of student learning, right? So this is exactly the kind of example I mean when I talk about maximizing the resource. We are not simply covering a page. We are using the lesson structure to support knowledge, discussion, application, observation, and reflection. And the level 4 learning thread shown on the slide gives us another important connection. Me, then my goals, then my friendships, then my family, then my actions, then conflict and peace, then diverse community. So even this lesson sits within a larger developmental journey. The student is not learning about friendship in isolation. The lesson contributes to the broader progression of the learner. Next slide. Right. So now we arrive at one of the key arguments of today's presentation, why HFLE must remain a standalone subject. And the slide gives us the answer very simply. We are not only preparing our students for examinations, we are preparing them for life. And I want to be clear because this is not an argument against examinations, right? Examinations have a place in education. Academic achievement has a place, but the educational experience should not be reduced to simply exam preparation, right? The skills identified in HFLE are not extra skills, okay? The slide says these are not extra skills, they are life skills. And that distinction is central. Communication is a life skill. Decision-making is a life skill. Relationship skills are life skills. Self-awareness is a life skill. And these capacities do not suddenly become relevant when a student leaves school. They are relevant while the student is in school, right? And they remain relevant beyond school, beyond the classroom. So if these are important areas of learning, then there is value in providing intentional instructional time for them. And a standalone subject gives HFLE a recognized place in the curriculum. It creates space for teachers to plan, it creates space for students to learn, and it creates opportunities for progression. And it also makes it possible to assess whether that intended learning is actually taking place. And it also prevents HFLE from becoming something that is always postponed because another subject or activity needs the time, right? And that is an important practical issue because if something is important, we need to give it space, right? We cannot repeatedly say that life skills matter while treating the time allocated to developing them as optional. So sustaining HFLE as a standalone subject is really about recognizing that these areas deserve intentionality, continuity, and structured learning. Next slide. Right. So the next slide asks, why now? And it states, the social environment in which our students are developing is changing. And that takes us back to where we began, right? Our students are developing in an environment that includes changing technologies, information systems, communication patterns, and social influences. And we cannot remove every influence, as I previously said. And the slide makes the point very clearly. We cannot protect students from every influence, but we can influence them to navigate it. And I think this is one of the strongest statements in this presentation because it recognizes the limits of what schools can control. We cannot control every conversation a student hears, and we cannot control every piece of information a student encounters, and we cannot control every interaction, right? This is impossible. But we can influence the learner. We can provide knowledge. We can provide opportunities to practice skills. We can provide opportunities for reflection, and we can model appropriate communication. We can help students think through situations, and we can create classrooms where students can ask questions and learn how to make informed choices. And that is why HFLE remains relevant, not because we expect it to solve every social problem, because it cannot, but because education has a role in preparing learners to navigate the environments in which they live. Next slide. Right. So now we turn the lens back to ourselves. The slide says the educator is part of the journey, and then HFLE develops the learner, but it also challenges the educator to grow. And that is an important statement, you know, because sometimes we speak about education as though the teacher has already arrived, as though the teacher knows everything, but effective educators are also learners. The slide tells us the teacher has to be willing to learn, reflect, and grow. And I think that is especially important in HFLE because when we teach communication, we should be willing to reflect on how we communicate, right? When we teach empathy, we should reflect on how we listen and respond to others. When we teach stress management, we can reflect on how we manage our own professional pressures. And when we teach relationships, we can reflect on how we relate to the people around us. And when we teach decision making, we can reflect on the choices we make ourselves, right? So the point is not that teachers always have to be perfect, right? We grow, we adjust, we learn, we make mistakes. We are human, right? But that process of reflection in itself is an important professional practice, right? And perhaps one of the most powerful things we can model for students is that learning does not stop when you become an adult. The teacher can say, I am still learning. I'm reflecting on that. I could have handled that situation differently. Let me try another approach. And that does not weaken the teacher's authority. It demonstrates reflective professionalism. So HFLE is not simply asking us, what do we teach? It is also asking, how do we teach? And perhaps even, who are we becoming as educators while we teach? And that is why the educator truly is part of the journey. So as we conclude, let us bring everything together. Today, we have explored more than a set of books. We began with the learner. We considered the changing environment. We considered the regional curriculum context. We examined the developmental thread across primary and secondary. And we looked at how the student book and teacher's guide work together. And we brought that discussion into an actual grade 4 classroom example. And the common thread throughout has been the learner. The resources provide content and learning opportunities, and the teacher provides the context and facilitation, and the learner is given opportunities to understand, practice, apply, and reflect. So our shared commitment is therefore to prepare our learners not only for examinations, but for life. And saying that does not diminish academic learning. It recognizes that education has multiple purposes and that life skills require intentional opportunities for development. So if we use HFLE resources purposely, protect instructional time, and keep the learner at the center, we strengthen the possibility of meaningful HFLE teaching and learning. And I want to emphasize something again. A resource by itself cannot create a strong lesson, right? Learning depends on the interaction among the curriculum expectations, the resource, teacher facilitation, and learner participation. So the message is not simply, use the book. The message is use the resource purposefully. Use it so that learning can move toward application, and reflection. And I want to thank you for the work you do with children and young people. The classroom is one of the places where learners have repeated opportunities to practice how they communicate, how they respond to others, how they make decisions, and how they reflect on their actions. And the Macmillan HFLE resources are tools within the larger educational process. The value is realized when teachers use them purposefully, when content becomes discussion, when discussion becomes practice, when practice becomes reflection, and learning becomes connected to real life. So my hope is that today's webinar has given you a clearer way to look at the resources, not simply as books, but as materials that can support a developmental and learner-centered approach to HFLE. So as you return to your schools and classrooms, I want to leave you with one practical takeaway. Before planning your next HFLE lesson, open the student book and teacher's guide together. Identify the intended outcome. Look at the activity. Look at the teacher's support. Then ask yourself, how will my learners discuss? How will they practice? How will they apply? And how will they reflect? And that is how the resource becomes part of professional planning, rather than simply becoming a book that students complete. Dedicated time, supportive school structures, reflection, and purposeful use of resources all contribute to sustainable HFLE. So thank you again for your time, your attention, and most importantly, your commitment to health and family life education. Together, we can continue preparing learners, not only for school, but for life. Thank you. Right, so I want to leave you with the resource information displayed here, and these references identify the Macmillan HFLE materials represented in today's presentation. Teachers and schools, they can use this information when identifying the appropriate student books, activity books, and teacher's guide for the relevant level.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic presentation. If anyone does have any questions now, please feel free to put them in the chat and we can ask them now. But also, if there's any questions that you have following the presentation, you can email us, or as I said at the beginning, there's a short survey, so you can put questions in there as well, and we can certainly pass them on to get them answered for you. There's been a few people asking about all the resources being sent to you. We'll make sure that everything that you've had today, so the presentation and also links to our YouTube channel, which is where the recording will be uploaded onto really, really shortly, will be sent to you via email. You'll also get certificates. So you'll have those to show that you've attended. And as I mentioned again, there'll be a link to the short survey. So everything that you've had here today from Miss Julien will be shared with you via the email that you registered with. I know a few of you may have been all in one room together, so I hope you enjoyed watching it all together. And please do share the information with your colleagues if you were the one that registered, so that everyone gets that information. So I can't see any other specific questions, but lots of really positive feedback on the chat. So thank you very much for joining. Sorry we overran short a little bit there, but it was a fantastic presentation. So I just want to extend our thanks once again to Miss Julien. It was really fantastic to have you here. So enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll end the presentation.